Friends, we are gathered here today to conclude Rule 7 of Jordan Bernt Peterson's Second Life Advice book. He's already thrown diamonds, Jung, and children at us in an attempt to show us how working as hard as we can on at least one thing will improve our lives. Let's see what else he has in his arsenal. Hopefully no wrenches?
What?
This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! I'd like to introduce a new face to the channel. This is Toby, and he's Max's kitty. And yeah, he's conked out right now because this kitten was exploding all day. I'm not sure if he's going to show up in the video or not, so yeah, there he is. He's back in this cube, and hopefully he'll still be there when I change camera angles. It's a Toby! Tobeans of a Toby! It's been a hot minute. So many minutes, let's just call it an hour, since we last braved the Beyond Order brine. This is part 3. I closed out part 2 with a comment about a pending surgery. That happened at the very end of September. While the surgery went well, the same cannot be said for the unprecedented times we're living in. Like, I'm filming this on the day of the inauguration. Plus, my body's propensity to find new things to add to the suffering stack. Like, I got a nasty cough for Christmas and bronchitis for New Year's. So, that was all fun. So it goes. Since we're wrapping up the chapter, and it's been a hot hour since part 2, a recap of the earlier parts is in order. And that's lowercase order, not capital O order. In the overture, we were told this rule would, quote, outline the crucial relationship between the discipline striving in a single direction and forging of the individual character capable of resilience in the face of adversity. Section 1. The value of heat and pressure. Peterson started this with a metaphor about the formation of diamonds, and a Jungian ass pull about the shiny symbolism therein. But it's not only about the glitter. The important part is how boring and undisciplined coal is turned into a diamond. Heat and pressure. Just like people, that heat and pressure is necessary to unify the fragmented aspects of our psyches. Without that, life's gonna suck. It's not just heat and pressure, though. Clear goals are also important in limiting and simplifying the world. If you haven't been diamonded and don't have appropriate goals, oatmeal cookies of doom await you, with depression raisins. And note 1, while an interesting read about the interplay between mental and physical health, didn't really speak to Pearson's claims here. The non-diamond person will be highly reactive and unhappy. Thou must be organized and goal-oriented. And that's the last we're going to hear about general goals for a bit. He's got a target for us to aim at. Section 2. The worst decision of all. Pearson describes the character building that happens in higher ed, if you ignore the confounds and correlational nature of everything he's saying. Failing that, any job would do. If you don't heed this advice, so much more doom awaits you. It's just, quote, casual identification with avant-garde artistic expression or substance use. So you best commit to something, specifically a job, but really, you have to pick something. Section 3. Discipline and unity. For some reason, he pivots to the development of the attentive discipline needed for working hard on one thing in kids. Parents can help with this. We spent some time going through his corporal punishment parenting advice from 12 Rules, as he leaves it incredibly vague how parents are meant to help here. Mini doom for kids, with him claiming a kid needs to get their emotions and instincts locked down by age 4, or else. We'll pick up the text discussion here, but just note that he also snuck temper tantrums in here, despite being a different thing entirely than this reference, which we'll talk about in a sec. And that's where we left things in part 2. To pick back up, let's review the visual shorthand I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, and this means this cognitive psychologist is doing the only reference discussion we'll have here. There isn't much, hence not rearranging everything. Plus kitten. We've already covered the end notes, and the rest of this is going to be his style-mad opinion for how we should be living our lives, so yeah, not much more to say, aside from you being able to help me tip things back over towards chaos by liking, commenting, subscribing, but also picking up some merch. I have Chaos Dragons aplenty, from clothing to mugs to stickers. The options aren't limitless, but there is a wide assortment for you to choose from. Right, on with the advice. Section 3 continued. Discipline and unity. Right, so as mentioned, last time we went on a bit of a research walkabout thanks to Peterson's second and final reference for this chapter. It was about the rates of physical aggression in kids by age and identified risk factors for the minority who persisted with the behavior. Peterson's by the age of 4 or else sentiment could be seen to be supported here. Kinda, like it's not overtly said, but it could sort of be there in the data. Also, that requires dumping a lot of important detail about the possible roots of the behavior, such as kids mirroring what they see at home. Zooming back out, the point of this paragraph is that kids have attentive discipline at a young age, which will bring their, quote, multiplicity of emotions and motivations into cohesion, but it also needs to be nurtured by parents, or else oatmeal raisin cookies of social ostracism doom await. Honestly, my brain's kind of glazing over at this. While I do appreciate that he's reintegrating ideas from earlier in the book, it'd be less of a slog if the ideas weren't this. The cohesion of emotions and motivations is also shaped by the kids' peers by way of the ever-present games. To play the game well, this gendered as girl, calling it out because it's such a rarity with Peterson, this girl needs to become a cog in the, quote, larger social machine, which is a sacrifice of the self that paradoxically develops the self, as it means the kid is learning to sacrifice the present for the future, thereby granting them good social standing. You catch all that? Good. You may or may not recall that a big part of the original 12 Rules, Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, was the importance of sacrifice. That investing in a sacrifice now could yield better gains in the future. This was codified in the Old Testament through various stories. Sharing is a form of sacrifice, something kids have to learn if they want to have friends. You might even need to sacrifice who you are now to be able to grow into who you could become. It is what Jesus would do, after all. All the sacrifice is to help reduce the inevitable suffering of life. Refusing to sacrifice is the evil path. It takes a super special Christian sacrifice to really defeat evil, and then this goes into a tangent about Jung and apologetics about how Christianity, while not perfect, is doing a lot better than what came before, and blah blah, Nietzsche blah. Peterson eventually, briefly, gets out of that tangent, saying that people need to be rigidly shaped into proper behavior. It's been a while, but recall, dear viewer, that this chapter started with a mangled metaphor about the formation of diamonds reflecting a great truth about ourselves, that the restrictive, constraining heat and pressure will mold us into competent people. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Work as hard as you can on at least one thing, and see what happens. Why write new rules when you can just remix the old ones and sell it all over again? Disciplining the child to achieve this is not destructive or repressive. No.
A child who has been disciplined properly, by contrast, by parents, other adults, and most significantly, by other children, does not battle with, defeat, and then permanently inhibit her aggression. Such a child does not even sublimate that aggression or transform it into something different. Instead, she integrates it into her increasingly sophisticated game-playing ability, allowing it to feed her competitiveness and heighten her attention, and making it serve the higher purposes of her developing psyche. She just becomes extremely good at being aggressive, transmuting what might otherwise be a disruptive drive into the focused perseverance and controlled competitiveness that make for a successful player.
I mean, we know he's all about aggression, especially between men, with the whole bit about civilized behavior only being possible with the background threat of violence.
When men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree.
But really? Only the third definition here kinda doesn't read as your child being like a hostile dog only being held back by the discipline leash. I can't view the world in the same way he does. I cannot accept that a healthy, well-adjusted person has aggression simmering away on a back burner, that our entire society is built on this foundation, or that his effective corporal punishment discipline style will achieve this. Well, okay, no. I guess it would teach those kids that the people in power can and will use physical violence on those subservient to them to make them act how they want.
By the dawn of adolescence, such a child can organize herself into ever more complex games. Joint, goal-directed activities that everyone plays voluntarily and that everyone enjoys and benefits from, even if only one person or one team can win at a time. This ability is civilization itself in its nascent form, at the level of the individual player and group. This is where both cooperation and the opportunity to compete and win make themselves simultaneously manifest. This is all necessary preparation for the more permanent choices that must be made for a successful adulthood.
Right, yeah. Civilization is just one really big game, with winners getting higher spots in the inevitable dominance hierarchies. As it has always been, so shall it ever be. And the losers of these games have obviously benefited from the system. That's why housing and food insecurity aren't currently major issues. This is so dumb. At this level of abstraction, describing everything as a game is practically meaningless. Just another deepity. We can do it too. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. The best actors are the ones who really commit to their roles, master the craft, thereby getting bigger parts in this grand play we call life. You don't want to be an extra in your own story, right? So you gotta craft those interesting plot points by whatevering the whatever. And sure, fine. Presumably if you're reading life advice books, that means you're feeling like something's missing or life could be better in some way. And maybe finding a useful metaphor will help you crack through and achieve growth and feel better about things. But can we not treat these metaphors like they're hacking the Matrix, which means the one sharing them is like Morpheus, which, no. I'm tempted to justify this because it's just, I don't even know. But my gut's telling me I'll need this in the future, so get comfortable and enjoy some style madness.
It is certainly possible and reasonable to have some doubt and argue about which game might best be played here and now, but it is not reasonable to state that all games are therefore unnecessary. Likewise, although it may be possible to argue about which morality is the necessary morality, it is not possible to argue that morality itself is thus unnecessary. Doubt about which game is appropriate right now is not about relativism. It is the intelligent consideration of context.
Who is arguing this? What games? Precision in speech, one of the original 12 rules, feels like something read in a fever dream right now. If you think an explicit example would help, you'd be wrong.
The fact that happiness is not appropriate, for example, at a funeral, does not mean that happiness itself lacks value.
Peterson continues to be proscriptive about how funerals should go. Why is happiness verboten? Why can't there be fond and yes, happy reminiscing about the deceased? But he's not done.
Likewise, the claim that morality is both necessary and inevitable is not totalitarian. It is merely the observation that basic, primitive, unidimensional values must be subsumed under socially organized structures for peace and harmony to exist and be maintained.
Try and guess where he's gonna go next. Seriously, maybe you'll get it right. I certainly didn't.
It was the bringing together of a warring multiplicity under the unifying doctrines of Christianity that civilized Europe. It could, perhaps, have been Buddhism, Confucianism, or Hinduism, insofar as the East is also broadly civilized and unified. But it could not have been the absence of any doctrine whatsoever. Without a game, there is no peace, only chaos.
Yep. Gotta bring this back to Big C, for some reason. Do recall that in his framework, religion or religious belief is not an ideology. It's ideology exempt. Not including Islam was a choice, especially with all the current tensions in India and China. But hey, we finally got a concrete idea of what he was intending with games in this last part. Why he had to obfuscate it, I'll leave as an exercise to the viewer. Similar to the abandoned ideology chapter, he's saying we need to have these religious games in play. Otherwise there'd be chaos dragons of doom. Get rid of any non-religious ideologies, but not the super duper old ones that may or may not make sense for everyone living today. It doesn't matter. Doom. Doom.
Furthermore, the game that exists must be playable. As we discussed in Rule 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. This means that it must be structured by a communally accepted set of rules, by only those constraints that many people are willing to abide by for a long time. It is possible that many such games exist, theoretically, but it is at least equally possible that there are only a few.
What if part of the community decides these rules actually aren't acceptable to us anymore? Are they supposed to just suck it up and keep playing because the rest of the community is still fine with it? Or do they separate out into two communities? Are they able to peacefully coexist, or will there be fighting? What if people don't want to play these sorts of games anymore? What then?
In any case, the rules of Christianity and the rules of Buddhism are by no means arbitrary, by no means nonsensical superstition, any more than the rules of a playable game are merely arbitrary or nonsensically superstitious.
Come here. Closer. Just between you and me, aren't some of the rules from various religions kind of arbitrary? Like, there may have been historical environmental pressures that encouraged different groups to have very specific rules about which foods were safe to eat and which ones were not. But some of the rules are just arbitrary. To go for some low-hanging fruit, why no mixing of textiles? No meat on Fridays? Why must a home be entered with the right foot? And on the pure games front, some rules truly are arbitrary. Like deciding who gets to go first. Could do it based on whose birthday is next. It doesn't really matter, it could be anything. It's arbitrary, as long as it's agreed upon by everybody. It seems like it could be a backdoor argument for a cosmic game master. Someone who wrote and enforces the rules.
To think that peace can exist without the overarching and voluntarily accepted game is to misunderstand the ever-present danger of the fragmented tribalism to which we can so easily and devastatingly regress.
Right, yeah. Because we aren't seeing massive tribal groups shake out right now in the US, even with these traditional games in play. Doesn't help that one tribe in particular is skirting or just ignoring the rules to their benefit at the expense of everyone else. But no, Peterson's right. This is much better than the alternative. It's been a while since we've seen it, but Peterson's still playing the pivot game, albeit a pivot back from a pivot. Remember how this was previously about a girl perfecting her aggression?
Once the social world has forced the child to integrate his multiple sub-personalities, he can play with others. After that, he should be ready to engage in the more serious games that make up jobs or professions, with their highly structured expectations, skills, and rules. He must learn those, as well as, when older, the dance of the sexes. He must integrate his socialized personality with that of another, so that the couple he makes with that other can exist together peacefully, productively, within society, over the long term, while maintaining voluntary willingness to do so.
Peacefully exist with me, Harold.
Marjorie, no!
Maintain voluntary willingness, Harold.
Oh, God.
Integrate with me, Harold. I wonder if that pivoted paragraph is a reflection of him feeling like he'd left out that religions as games thought while editing, so just plopped it in there. Because that is a long-ass paragraph about that. Right in the middle of this aggression, games, development, and kids stuff with not really much in the way of connective tissue. Remember way back when this was about apprenticeships? Peterson just did.
This is the dual process of psychological and social integration that accompanies apprenticeship, all associated with the outsourcing of sanity. Adherence to this process will make him a socially sophisticated, productive, and psychologically healthy adult capable of true reciprocity, and perhaps the temporary suspension of the demand of reciprocity necessary to raise children.
I really hope the implication at the end here is about not expecting reciprocity from the kids. My initial reading of it yielded an interpretation with not expecting it from your partner, which just, I hope is wrong. But that I'm not sure speaks pretty poorly on the lobster doctor shtick. There's also this outsourcing sanity thing again, although it being associated with apprenticeships is certainly a novel angle. He is all about integrating in this book, especially with the goal of the psychological and social kind. Integrate the archetypes or instincts or personalities or whatever, play the game. Integrate, play the professional game. Integrate with your spouse, play the reproduction game. Integrate at your apprenticeship, play the sanity game. up and up and up.
But the story of integration and socialization does not end here. This is because two things are happening at once during an apprenticeship worthy of the name, just as learning to play a game and learning to be good at a sport happened at the same time while playing. Initially, the apprentice must become a servant of tradition, of structure, and of dogma, just as the child who wants to play must follow the rules of the game. At its best, this servitude means grateful alliance, in one form or another, with the institutions typically considered patriarchal.
What? Sure. When you're apprenticing, you're learning the way a job works, and if you want to be that guy, you could call the way electricians do things tradition, dogma, or rules of the game. Why not? And to be the guy that backs up that guy, you could say that Peterson's creative conservative updating tradition could be the way that new things are dealt with and added into the electrician's standards. But again, this is only adding a layer of complexity that's only really a metaphor. There's not predictive value here. Going back to my theater alternative, an apprentice would be the understudy for a part, and somebody new to their role needs to learn the lines and the entrances and other stage cues. There is some room for interpretation, but by and large, they are there to do a job as written for them in the script. Does that really help us grow as people? No. It does, however, instruct us to view tradition as the rules of the game, an almost unchangeable part of reality, handed down to us by our wise ancestors that we should obey if we want to do well. Oh, and of course, these things are in service of, quote, institutions typically considered patriarchal. Because reasons. So, no joke, when my husband got to that quote, because he proofs my scripts, he read it, laughed, and asked me if it's really saying what he thinks it's saying, and yeah, no, it's exactly what it says.
Apprenticeship means heat and pressure. As new workmen are tried by their peers, as articling law students are tried by their employers, as medical residents are tried by physicians, nurses, and patients. The goal of this heat and pressure is subordination of an underdeveloped personality, by no means individual at this point, to a single path for the purposes of transformation from undisciplined beginner to accomplished master.
As per my comment on the last chunk, what? This is the classic Peterson problem, once again. At a superficial level, this kind of makes sense. Someone in training at a job is learning how to do it, as informed by relevant feedback from their peers, employers, or clients. Eventually, they can mostly stand on their own. But if we pick at the specifics, it rapidly gets bogged down with questions. Why is he so explicit about where these different fields are getting their feedback from? Like, workmen are only getting tried by their peers, not their employers or their clients. Newbie lawyers aren't put through their paces by their clients. And doctors are really worried about their employers, especially when they have stupid insurance requirements or whatever. What's all this about the, quote, subordination of an underdeveloped personality? Why is a subordinated person not an individual during or after an apprenticeship? Is this single path their job or something else? I know this is calling back to an idea earlier this chapter, that a person needs to commit to a career path in order to develop their personality. Didn't seem to follow then, doesn't seem to now. This begs the question, why does a person's personality growth have to essentially be tied to a job? Heat and pressure, blah, 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 I know, but he's only really got anecdata here. He saw it in students and clients, therefore it's true, except for the flurry of concerns and holds that arise. Does the job itself matter? Would flipping burgers foster the same amount of growth as going to grad school? He told his clients to take whatever path was available to them, even if it seemed beneath them, so presumably this would be the case. But the skills and demands of these two are very different, so how would this work? What if someone changes paths? Do they lose the personality progress they've made, or do they get to carry it over? Does he consider stay-at-home parenting a job path? If somebody opts to do that instead of getting a job, are they depriving themselves of that potential growth? Earlier this chapter, he included family as part of his valuable commitment list, even ranking it above a career. But as you'll see when we get to the marriage advice chapter, this advice is mainly focused at men. Women are supposed to prioritize family and child rearing. if it means no job for them, so be it. But how is a mom supposed to gain the apprenticeship benefits? Maybe he'd argue that the mom is tried by the kids, but who is she supposed to apprentice under? Oh no. Maybe I'm putting pieces together uncharitably, but it seems warranted to conclude the mom would be subordinate to the dad, that he's her master. Well, hate that. This is how we're wrapping up this section. Once a person is done apprenticing, they're now the master, creative conservative who can update tradition, blah, blah, blah. Something surprising to me here is not that he slipped in a biblical thing, because that's normal, but that he's decided not to tell us which translation he's working with. This will be much more apparent in the next section. The F's on things seem to indicate it could be the King James Version, which he has used before, but Homeboy only had 2 references this chapter. He didn't want a third? He thought this was so obvious as to not need a reference? I'm really not sure. It's something he clarified in 12 Rules, but flipping through the endnotes back here, and it's not something he's done. But if we go way back to the start of the book in Rule 1, there is a footnote on page 44 that all biblical citations are from the King James Version unless otherwise noted. So apparently we're supposed to just carry that through the rest of the book. This really just is the creative conservative shtick from Rule 1. That change to the traditional dogma can only come from someone appropriately respectful of tradition, therefore likely a conservative. The master, one who sits atop the competence hierarchy, has the developed personality capable of conservative creative transformation. This, of course, is represented in the gospel. Guess where Rule 7's going next? Section 4, Dogma and Spirit. The game's rules instruct the player what not to do. Following these thou shalt nots develops a person's character into a desirable game player. Peterson's thoroughly just outed himself as a non-gamer. If literal games only had rules about what you shouldn't do, it'd be impossible to play. There needs to be rules or goals more concrete than whatever is supposed to be done. Without those, playing the game would be so frustrating as you'd be stumbling blindly until a shout not is hit. Now, I can see that this might be an uncharitable read of what he's saying. Just because he hasn't specified that there are also thou shalts doesn't mean those aren't known to the player. However, I'd still argue that those are just as important in developing the player as the boundary conditions, and he's omitted them. So it's the balance between what you are and aren't allowed to do and figuring out how best to play in this space. The frustrating thing is that negotiation is supposed to be the through line of this book, the harmony between order and chaos. But he is, once again, focusing in on the order half of the equation.
As is the case in many other situations, it appears that this idea is already implicit in the stories that make up the bedrock of our culture. This is particularly evident in the Gospel of Mark, which is a commentary on what are among the most influential rules of the game ever formulated. The Mosaic 10 Commandments, and even more broadly, a commentary on rules themselves. The commandments follow.
And he proceeds to list them out, amusingly with typos on the first 2. Then he gives a quick explanation of each from a traditional lobster perspective. Like, his explanation of the first is that it, quote, speaks to the necessity of aiming at the highest possible unity. In trying to figure out which Bible version he was working from, especially with the back and forth about whether the 6th is best translated as not to kill or not to murder, I pulled up Wikipedia. Interestingly, under the religious interpretation section, it notes that the commandments aren't as explicit as other biblical laws, meaning that they were written more as guidelines, with the intent they be contextually interpreted. An interpretation job Peterson's doing for the reader, somewhat paradoxically setting a meaning in stone. Especially if we focus in on his interpretation of the 8th, thou shalt not steal. This could almost be a Marxist take if we just forgot who wrote it. Instead of guidelines, the commandments are a, quote, minimum set of rules for a stable society, which is itself a, quote, iterable social game. Somehow, the existence of the commandments indicate that following the traditionally determined rules of the game will reveal the ultimate unified version of yourself that will develop from single-mindedly working at a goal. That seems like a non sequitur to me, but I'm just a filthy atheist, so what do I know? Here I was, thinking that the Ten Commandments were a sort of covenantal group of rules for the Jews and later Christians, when really, I should have been seeing them as the precursor to Peterson's brilliant, 24 at time of recording, rules for life. Something that will help me in my personal growth journey. How naive I was. Peterson says the Jesus story about kicking the merchants and money changers out of the temple is relevant to the ideas of the last paragraph. He includes the full passage about Jesus shutting down the Pharisees and Herodians who were sent to, quote, catch him in his words.
What does this all mean? The personality integrated by disciplined adherence to a set of appropriate rules is simultaneously, although perhaps unknowingly, guided by or imitating the highest possible ideal, precisely the ideal that constitutes whatever common element of moral makes all the rules good, just, and necessary. That ideal, according to Christ's answer, is something singular, the one Lord, thoroughly embodied, loved with all thy heart, soul, understanding, and strength, and then manifested as a love that is identical for self and all mankind.
Obviously, right? I am a cognitive psychologist, not a biblical scholar, and was basically raised a holiday Christian, so please forgive me if my research has led me astray. This New Testy snippet is pulled from Mark, one of the 4 gospel writers in the Christian canon. 3 of them, including Mark, largely told the same stories with slight variations. As such, we can look at the non-Mark ones and get a little more context. The others make it more clear what Jesus is being questioned about. So if you're as well versed on this as me, quick recap. Jesus and his crew pulled up to the Temple of Jerusalem and disrupted the business going on there and dipped. This pissed off many people. The next day, Jesus and friends showed up again, and Jesus was questioned by, quoting a paper analyzing the meaning instead of Peterson's phrase, quote, representatives of the Jewish leadership. The non-Mark versions lead in with the question specifically being about what authority Jesus claims for his actions. Jesus flipped it back at them, asking what authority John the Baptist claimed before going into some parables. John was a popular figure around those parts. He'd previously baptized Jesus in a ceremony said to end with God making an appearance, which validated Jesus' authority, and at some point John was martyred. So Jesus hitting them with the John question was a non-answer that allowed Jesus to evade the trap where the authorities were hoping to nail him for blasphemy. This non-answer also rhetorically, to people hearing this story, helped connect Jesus' authority to John's, as well as God rolling in to say,
"That's my boy. No, my boy! Father, help!"
Other online sources say this is Jesus being a clever trickster, or it's about accepting Jesus as an authority out of faith, plus countless other variations, I'm sure. Broadly, it seems like a common interpretation is to take the story mostly at face value. Jesus was questioned about the authority he had to wreck things in the temple. He gave a non-answer that subtextually called out his questioners while also implicitly linking his prophet train up to John's, and this let him escape to preach another day. We can see Peterson's not satisfied with that. It has to fit into a bigger meaning with a capital M about the true nature of capital B being. The next part has an explanation for the appropriateness of this choice. To use one of his favorite problematic phrases, Judeo-Christian tradition is baked into the West. Quote, psychologically speaking,
you have no psychology here.
Christ is a representation of the results of apprenticeship, wherein the trainee manifests a spirit by mastering the dogma. This spirit is the creative conservative force that can update the traditional dogma. And apparently, trainees need to produce a masterpiece to become a master. Pedantically, some apprenticeships do end with the creation of something. Thesis degrees, like a PhD, involve writing and defending a dissertation. Not sure I'd call any I've seen a masterpiece, but I'm also not hopped up on style madness like Peterson. I wasn't aware that resident doctors, electricians, or arguing lawyers also had to generate a masterpiece. This claim is just silly. This whole thing is silly, especially the idea that he's speaking psychologically at any point in this. Jungishly, sure, but not more broadly than that. To his credit, though, he tried to bring this back to apprenticeships. In the final couple paragraphs of this chapter, yes, dear viewer, we are here. There is 2 paragraphs plus a sentence left, and we are this far afield. There's more blah blah Bible stuff about Jesus as the creative conservative, as well as a claim that the deep content of the Old Testament are the recurring creative conservatives fighting corrupted dogma. It is a personality who mimics that model who might be regarded as truly Western in the deepest of the psychological senses. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're telling everyone you're the prophesied one, you'd have to at least say you're anchored in tradition but are leading people in a new direction. The old ways are good, but lo, we have strayed far from that path. The new way, my way, will be better. Appease before the sales pitch. Get that foot in the door. Jesus being described as having said this, after the fact by secondary sources, not eyewitnesses, lends credence to the idea he is the Jewish Messiah, which then allows for the whole Christian faith. To say all that succinctly, unlike Peterson, I'm not inclined to see any of this as indicating anything about the West's unconscious, that Jesus reflects anything of this, psychologically speaking. If you're doing some Jung-derived literary analysis of the text, sure, but that doesn't mean the results are truly baked into things. Psychologically. This is the pilot speaking, letting you know we're finally clear to make our descent into the ending of this roll. It's been a bumpy ride, so we thank you for flying with Eris Airways.
If you work as hard as you can on one thing, you will change. You will start to also become one thing, instead of the clamoring multitude you once were. That one thing, developed properly, is not only the disciplined entity formed by sacrifice, commitment, and concentration. It is that which creates, destroys, and transforms discipline itself, civilization itself, by expressing its unity of personality and society. It is the very word of truth, upon whose function all habitable order, wrenched out of chaos, eternally depends. Work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing, and see what happens.
Those are some pretty lofty promises, and all from just working really hard at something. Pity, it all started kind of vague, only really got into relevant specifics for the importance of training for a career, and closes out with emphatic motions of how this is archetypically meaningful at the global level. Of course, this is having to be, quote, wrenched out of chaos. Despite his claims that this book is about the balance between order and chaos, he can't help but center his advice in Order City, constantly fighting against the encroaching chaos forest. It's not important that other cultures or religions are able to actually walk this balance. They aren't the unconscious underpinning of the West, so he's instead trying to shift the fulcrum over towards order and insist it still balances just fine. Chapter wrap-up. Did we get what was described in the overture? Not really, no. The different pieces are here, more or less, but I don't think they've been meaningfully assembled into a completed life advice puzzle. The single-direction discipline striving was here, almost entirely in the context of apprenticing for a job. We were repeatedly told about the heat and pressure of that training building character. Specifically, a Christ-like creative conservative character. I'd say the closest we got to this resilience to adversity was in the or else-ing of someone not getting turned into a diamond. But the crucial relationship between striving and character building, I think that was only really brute forced as being a thing. He just repeated the idea that character growth would come from disciplined striving rather than demonstrating the correlation of the two. It's just repetition after repetition after repetition that striving causes growth. And it's only occurring to me now that he describes it as a relationship in the overture, but treats it as having a causal link in the chapter. My prediction that this chapter would be a combination of the original 12 rules, Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, and Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, seems to have been mostly accurate, albeit incomplete. Because who could have foreseen all of the child discipline and development stuff? Broadly, it seems like goals should have come up more. He brought them up as being important in simplifying the world and forcing you to make a choice so you're not tormented by everything. But then he narrows it down to higher ed or, quote, the best path currently available to his clients, contextually meaning a job. Otherwise you'll drift aimlessly on the oatmeal raisin cookie of doom highway. Wandering through musings on his views of child development, or expositing about religion as games does not give the reader assistance in applying this advice. This is a weird omission for him, since he's usually all about aiming at the highest meaning goal. It's like he super glossed over that part so he could skip to the Christianity chase. The way this chapter wanders, it's almost like he had some sort of length requirement and realized he couldn't hit it when it was just about the importance of apprenticing into something. So then the core advice got fluffed up with the first section's diamond metaphor, the inherent sacrifice involved in commitment, kids, and traditional Christian dogma. Or, I suppose, this could just be the result of his style madness skewing things towards cosmic consequence. The core advice in this chapter isn't as egregiously bad as some others, quite possibly thanks to how tangential and not grounded the bulk of it is. That doesn't mean it can't be improved upon, though. I think this has come up in almost every rule for this book, but it's good to keep a growth mindset throughout your life. At the very least, there's always new things to learn. It's also good to give things you're working on a solid attempt, from hobbies to jobbies. That said, Peterson's almost blind pursuit of working as hard as you can on the thing and seeing what happens doesn't leave room for you to pump the brakes or get out of the car entirely. Maybe you're working really hard at adult gymnastics? I don't know. You're going to practice, you're doing work at home, but you know what? Maybe you were cursed with a vestibular system as bad as my own. Your balance might be hot garbage. Seems like Peterson's advice would be to keep pushing yourself, keep smashing into the equipment every time you get the twisties, in the hopes that someday you will become a master gymnast. I'd counter that if you want to keep doing that, by all means, just keep smashing away, because it is a free country. Maybe, hopefully. But be realistic about your limitations. Some things in life require physical or mental attributes that not everyone has. That doesn't mean that you should quit adult gymnastics, but just maybe don't seriously hurt yourself in pursuit of a goal state that just might not be possible for you. That's okay. This is sort of in the chapter title, but wasn't in the concluding paragraph, so here we go. I would suggest, if you can, to maybe not just work on one thing at a time and see what happens, but work on a couple things in parallel, so you're not putting all of your thing eggs in one work basket. Absolutely. Try to find a job path that's able to fulfill your needs. Maybe even more than just financial needs if you're incredibly lucky. But don't become so laser focused in pursuit of that other things fall by the wayside. The soul cannot thrive on just work alone. Even SpongeBob, the archetypal good employee, had a rich life outside of the Krusty Krab. I'll also add that a lot of this advice focuses on being an integrated, put-together person, which is exemplified by being impervious to getting knocked down by what life dishes out. If you falter, you haven't successfully come into a Jungian union, to which I say pogwash and balderdash and other old-timey phrases. Such a simplistic take would be surprising from a clinical psychologist, or anyone other than Dr. P. As we talked about in part 2, this reactivity can be a feature of many of the neurodivergencies. There are coping strategies and techniques to help you deal with things and lessen the impact or the severity of an emotional reaction to something, but we're all human and life can suck. We shouldn't be required to stoically soldier on lest we be perceived as immature. For all of his incorporation of Christianity throughout his work, he doesn't give the reader much grace. And I think that's all I've got to say about this chapter. There was a lot to dig through, especially with his use of those references, but at the zoomed out level, it's pretty straightforward. Up next is the interior decoration chapter. Seriously, Rule 8. Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. Until next time, bye.